Good morning, everyone. My name is KK, and today I'm going to kind of be going over my summary of my report about recidivism and patterns of recidivism and kind of why this is so important. So, the point of today's presentation is just going to be me talking to you guys about how difficult this is for the correctional system, and what research tells us about factors that contribute to reoffending. So I'm gonna kind of explain what recidivism is and talk about the correctional system, prison experiences, and going ahead with some takeaways and decision makers that we can use to kind of help recidivism rates. So when we're going in and we're defining recidivism, it is the return to criminal behavior after an individual has been arrested and released from prison or jail. So this is measured by rearrests, reoffending, conviction, getting reincarcerated within a certain time period. So recidivism is super important because it's used by every correctional agency to measure how effective our correctional policies and programming is to inmates. So there's a lot of research that shows that recidivism rates are super high and they've remained high. There was a study from Lane and Levin that found that 2/3 of individuals released from prison were ultimately arrested again within 3 years. So when you're thinking about that statistic specifically, that is super high rates. So these high rates also are going to increase correctional costs. We don't often talk about how much it costs to house these individuals. You may think about like feeding them and healthcare and stuff like that, but truly it costs a lot to house inmates. So this also takes a big strain on the prisons and jails, the public resources. And then this also is going to raise concerns about public safety. So these outcomes show us that incarceration alone is just not effective in preventing, future criminal behavior. So when we're looking ahead at the correctional system and punishment, the U.S. correctional system has prisons, jails, probation, and parole. Those are kind of our main forms of punishment, maybe some community service in there. Prisons are going to generally house individuals who have been convicted of more serious crimes. We're talking, murder, child abuse, deadly assault with a weapon, things of that nature. And then we're going to have jails holding individuals who are either awaiting trial or they're in there for a more short period of time. Maybe they've committed a crime of petty theft or, something of that kind of nature. And then we have probation and parole, which allow individuals to remain in community, but they are going to be under some sort of supervision. So whether that's house arrest, doing community service, they are reporting to someone, whether they have to go to a parole board, have a parole officer. They are not directly incarcerated, but they are still under supervision. So in recent decades, we have talked about the United States focusing pretty heavily on incarceration. We have some of the highest incarceration rates in the world, more than any other country. So a lot of that has to do from being heavily focused on sentencing and incarceration strictly. So we've had sentencing policies that have done like mandatory minimums, and that has ultimately affected the ability for people to be able to get reduced parole eligibility, and it has increased sentence lengths and prison populations, which is super important. Research also tells us that longer periods of incarceration are not going to significantly. So research is going to show that long periods of incarceration and harsh punishment do not significantly reduce recidivism or reoffending. In fact, they might even increase reoffending because when individuals return to their community, they have very little support and treatment, and most likely in prison or jail, they did not address whatever issues they came in with. So I would almost compare it to being really sick, not knowing what's wrong with you, going to the hospital, and in the hospital, you don't get any treatment, so you're left leaving with the same issue you came in with instead of getting proper treatment, medication, and ultimately returning back home and getting to a better space. That's pretty much what I would do a comparison to. So when we're looking at correctional programming, and also we're going to discuss women, but firstly, correctional programming is designed to reduce recidivism by addressing things that are correlated to criminal behavior. So this can include treatment of substance abuse, mental health services, education, job training, financial training. This can be so many different things that could ultimately be really beneficial to people that are incarcerated. There's plenty of studies that show individuals who have participated in this, and this is evidence-based programs, they are less likely to reoffend after release. Access to these programs is very few in between, very limited. Many incarcerated individuals have a mental health disorder, substance abuse issue, and while they're incarcerated, they're not receiving adequate treatment. And then when we go to look at women in prison ultimately face additional challenges. They often can experience higher rates of trauma. We have substance abuse issues, mental health disorders, and they ultimately experience this at higher rates than men, according to statistics. So a lot of women are also caregivers prior to being incarcerated. Their mothers, their wives, their caretakers. And this is really important because when we don't have gender responsive treatment individualized to different people, then ultimately treatment wouldn't be as effective. So we want women facing greater difficulties during reentry, to be able to increase their risk of getting help and brought to services they need versus ending up with higher recidivism rates and ending up reoffending. So when we're going and looking into correctional clients and prison experience, we notice a lot of patterns. So a lot of correctional individuals that are incarcerated, they can be convicted of drug and property crimes, violent offenses. We have drug offenders who struggle with drug addiction. And different people may face financial instability. We have violent offenders. And when they do reoffend, now we have a higher risk to public safety, which I know is a concern of a lot of people. So prison itself is structured around control and punishment, those two things. So when we have control and we have punishment, rather than treatment, individuals are going to be experiencing strict routines. They have a set time of when they can wake up, eat, who they can talk to, what they can do. They have limited freedom. They're also isolated. They're separated from family and their community, which shows worsened mental health. You're isolated, you may become depressed. And ultimately, that's not going to adequately address issues that they came in with. So when we're looking at patterns of recidivism, they have remained pretty consistent over the years during different studies. Most reoffending occurs within 3 years after release. And this is also going to be more common with people who have prior criminal histories, limited education, substance abuse issues, mental health problems and disorders, and people with disabilities. So those are the people that are going to be more likely to reoffend. So I think it's really important to know that recidivism is going to be remaining a challenge in the correctional system because nobody can agree or come up with solutions as to how we can lower these rates. Everyone talks about kind of the idea of let's get these people treatment, but how are we going to do that? Who's going to pay for it? Some of these are questions, and who's going to have access? The people that have access, is that something that they're even going to want to utilize? But most importantly, when we're thinking about all of those things, we're thinking about community safety, we're thinking about who it is going to help, and we're just thinking about reducing recidivism. And this is going to require a lot of correctional programming and policies that are going to address the underlying cause of criminal behavior. I had seen a few people already writing down some questions, and before I went ahead and went in with questions and rebuttals, I wanted to answer some questions that I thought people might have when I got done. So one of the questions that I thought might be asked is, why not only focus on people who are incarcerated? Why were we talking about people who were on parole or probation, house arrest? That is still a form of control, and ultimately it's still a punishment. It's in our legal system, it's in our criminal justice system, and those people are actively out in the community. If anything, I feel those people are just as, if not more important than the people who are incarcerated, because they're actively out in our community. So it's very important that we look at those individuals as well, instead of solely focusing on people who are incarcerated. So a lot of, again, those people are leaving jails and prisons without treatment, going home. They might be on probation after leaving jail or prison, and they have no community, they have no treatment, they have no therapy. They're kind of left on their own, isolated into this community without support and without resources. Now they're likely to go reoffend. So that gets into kind of my next point. Who is most likely to reoffend? So some factors are going to be individuals with substance abuse problems, prior criminal history, people with mental health disorders and disabilities, and people with limited education. These are the key points and that we look at to see who's most likely to reoffend. Another question I thought we might ask is, why focus on women? Why discuss women? And that's because studies have shown that women face higher rates of trauma and mental health issues. So having gender responsive programming is pretty important. And they also face sometimes greater challenges when we're looking at re-entry because they may have been a caretaker previously. Another question that I thought that would get asked is why and when does reoffending usually occur? So most recidivism is going to recur within the first 3 years after release. And again, that just happens because people have limited access to resources, community support, and they ultimately resort back to their old ways that were probably not treated when they were incarcerated. So that's my presentation, and I wanted to give anyone a chance if they had any rebuttals, to kind of go ahead and answer some rebuttals and answer some questions that anyone may have had. Yes, you can go ahead. So you asked which factor. Sure. So your question is, what factor contributing to reoffending do I believe agencies should prioritize first? So, based on my research, I believe that agencies should prioritize substance abuse and mental health disorders because these factors have been consistently linked to higher rates of recidivism, especially in individuals who do not receive treatment during incarceration or after release. So many correctional clients are going to struggle with addiction if untreated mental illness, and without proper intervention, these issues are going to continue into society when they are released. Focusing on treatment for these has been shown to reduce the likelihood of rearrest and reincarceration. So I think that's a really good starting point for agencies. I seen you had a question as well. How does my presentation support the need for treatment-based programming? Yeah, so my presentation supports treatment-based programming by highlighting research and studies that show that we can reduce recidivism rates. So there's studies cited that individuals who have participated in these evidence-based programs, they are able to properly get an education, whether that's getting a high school diploma, a GED, taking a few college courses, getting job training for skilled labor. They can get access to a job when they leave, which is a huge release of financial stress. And that's something that can ultimately contribute to their mental health. Getting people with drug addiction treatment is so important because if you're not treating that, you're going to go right back to the same old ways as before you were incarcerated. You're going to go back to drugs. You're going to go back to doing what you were doing prior. So that's very important. And, we need treatment-based programming. It's really necessary. And I think that's going to be ultimately effective when we're looking at correctional policies. Yes, you had a rebuttal. Right. I agree, and I think that's a very valid concern. So your concern is that a lot of these programs are really expensive, and how can we justify the cost of that? So I think that, again, is a very valid concern. I think repeated incarceration, though, is also extremely costly. We kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. And when you're really thinking about it, the cost to incarcerate people, we're not even going to get into private prisons and all of that today. But when we're looking at the cost of incarcerating people, that is way more, or equal to in some cases, the cost of these programs that we're wanting to implement, things like therapy, proper health care, proper drug addiction treatment, education. And in many cases, you might be investing up front with a higher cost of getting those programs, but in the long run, that is going to save money because you are not going to be having people reoffend as much. And ultimately, that's going to lower the reoffending rate and reduce the cost of housing inmates because they're not reoffending and coming back, which is super important. You also had a rebuttal. I agree. So your rebuttal is that some people just don't want to change. How can these programs help them? So we have to also think realistically here when we're talking about reoffending. You cannot save everyone. So not every individual is going to succeed, but there is research that shows that even modest reductions in recidivism can have a very big impact on public safety and cost. So programs are effective when they're targeted to high-risk individuals and focused on specific needs like addiction and mental health. So again, you were right that not everyone is going to be successful with that. And some people may even not want to utilize that, but there is going to be people who are going to benefit that. And those people that are going to benefit, that's what we have to focus on. We have to focus on the idea of reducing reoffending, reducing a threat to public safety. And that is the important part. You can't save everyone, but if you can save a few people, that overall is going to impact public safety as a whole. So that was a great question. I wanted to just thank everyone for coming in and listening to my research findings. I think my research really does suggest that investing in treatment and rehabilitation is more cost effective than solely relying on punishment and incarceration to reduce reoffending. And I would encourage everyone to do their own research into this as well and think of ways to help the community and the ultimately large impact this would have on public safety. I appreciate everyone coming out and listening and asking questions, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.